Hello and welcome to the Bigger Than Us podcast. I'm your host, Raj Daniels, and today I'd like to welcome Brett Hogarth to the show. Brett has held the position of Director of Business Development for the Biomass Advisory Group for 9 years. Over that time, he has led new product development and marketing efforts, managed client relations, and structured work plans for over 250 biomass feedstock supply chain consulting projects across North America. Brett has been integral in identifying and executing on opportunities to leverage Ecostrat's data and analytics to provide new and innovative solutions to meet the needs of stakeholders across the bioenergy industry. Brett, how are you doing today?
I'm well. Thanks for having me.
Brett, thank you for being on. Brett, I'd like to kick things off by asking my guest the following question. If you were asked to share something interesting about yourself, what would it be?
That's a great question. So, I something that's interesting about me is I play guitar in a four-piece rock band. This dates back to my university days when some friends of mine all lived in a house together. We built a jam space in the basement using a bit of wood, but a lot of fruit crates that we would source from a local fruit market to diffuse the sound. And we'd just go down there and play music. After we graduated, two friends and I found a rehearsal studio in the city and recruited a drummer, and we've been playing more or less ever since. So every Wednesday we head down to the jam space, as we call it, and play for 3 or 4 hours and head home. So it's we don't take it too seriously. It's more for the fun of it. But there you go. We've recorded a few times and have played a few gigs around Toronto. So it's a lot of fun.
So, a couple of questions. What kind of guitar?
I play a 1977 Les Paul Custom. So it's a vintage, very old guitar I bought when I was in high school, and still my only guitar to this day.
And what kind of music?
It would be described probably as a fusion between rock and punk. So it's up-tempo, pretty loud. Again, it's instrumental, so there's no vocals. So it's loud and fast and a lot of fun to play.
And lastly, I didn't realize you were in Toronto. Toronto is one of my favorite cities in the world.
Oh, thanks for saying that. Yeah, it's a wonderful place to live.
I absolutely love it. I've been up there many times. In fact, I've driven there from Dallas at least 4 or 5 times.
Oh, wow. How long is that drive?
It's 24 hours nonstop, 3 8-hour shifts.
Oh, wow. Good. Well,
and it's well worth the drive.
I'll bet the scenery on the way is not too bad either.
It's beautiful. Although I must say that I was caught there once in the winter, and I vowed never to go back post-October. So between October and, let's say, April-ish, you guys can have it.
I think that's right. We'll take it, and you're absolutely right. There's no reason to visit after October. Unless you enjoy skating or cross-country skiing.
Yep, totally agree. So, Brett, switching gears a little bit, can you share a little bit about your current company that you're working with?
Sure. So, Ecostrat is what I call a biomass supply chain solutions company. So, biomass is an umbrella term we use to talk about organic byproducts, so wood waste, agricultural waste, food waste, and human waste. So we're comprised of two groups. Our biomass supply group acquires waste biomass from large point source generators and upcycles that waste to value-added markets. So a lot of this waste would typically be sent to landfill. So we're circumventing that sort of linear disposal supply chain and moving it into markets that would use it for power, for heat, to produce another product, or to sort of manage other products. So we've been in this space for over 20 years. We move about 500,000 tons of the types of waste that I mentioned before on an annual basis. And so really to boil that down, our company really builds biomass supply chains. The second group, and this is the group that I manage, is our advisory group. So in our advisory group, we provide bespoke information services to developers, to lenders and investors in the space that need to answer questions or develop data around where they should site facilities, how much waste is generated in a certain region, what's the addressable market, how much could they capture of that waste, what does the pricing look like, how much would they be paid, or how much would they have to pay to source these materials, how is it being managed currently, et cetera, et cetera. So we're brought in by project developers to sort of help them either identify sites that would be good for development, or to help them actually source the material, to review their contracts. We're brought in at a whole bunch of different times in a development cycle, and then the investors and lenders would bring us in at a project finance stage to due diligence around a project's feedstock supply. So that's who we are.
Very interesting. If you could explain, what is a point source originator?
A point source generator is anyone that's producing large quantities of a biomass byproduct. So in the waste wood business, of which we move significant quantities, these would be sawmills. They would be transfer stations that are receiving waste wood and separating it from the rest of the concrete or drywall or other materials that they're bringing in. These could be loggers in the forest that are delimbing trees as they're harvesting, and may grind up that wood into a truck that we would send there to pick up that residue, and we would move it to a market that would use it. On the food waste side, it tends to be food processors. So the Pepsis and Coca-Colas and large meat processors and Campbell's and just the major food companies that we all know and love. So we would send a truck to pick up their a byproduct from their manufacturing process, usually a wastewater sludge type of material, and then we would move that to anaerobic digestion markets and a few others. So they're broadly, they're large sources of a byproduct that historically the waste that byproduct would be sent to a landfill rather than a beneficial market.
So it almost sounds like you've created almost like a broker position or a marketplace. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's right. We're acquiring the material. We're managing the logistics. So we're a broker, but we're actually taking title of the material. So we fancy ourselves as traders because we're doing that sort of end-to-end management piece as well.
And so is storage part of taking title for yourselves?
Storage would require an additional cost that many markets could not bear. So often we would push the inventory requirement back onto our suppliers. There have been cases where we would have to process or reprocess a material. So we have in the past set up yards or processing equipment to be able to process the material to meet a spec that's required. But every time you're touching it, these are physical commodities. Every time you're handling, unloading, loading, processing, you're adding significant cost to the ultimate buyer. So where possible, you would avoid any kind of sort of inventory that would be between the actual supplier and the end market.
Of course. And you mentioned commodities. So are there significant price fluctuations in the different biomass sources?
So that's going to depend on the type of biomass. We're based in Toronto. We aggregate and supply a lot of construction and demolition wood waste, which is waste, as the name describes, comes from new home construction or new construction and demolition of old homes. So all of that waste is aggregated. It's processed and sorted and ground into a product, and then we take the product and move it to markets that we supply. And that market in Ontario, for example, has fluctuated quite dramatically based on changes on the demand side. So it's it really depends. It's really a game of managing the delivery cost or the tip cost, and if there's anything that changes on the demand side, then yeah, price can swing quite dramatically.
Very interesting. So Brett, switching gears a little bit, the focus of this show is the why behind what you're doing. And so what I mean by that is that there's an opportunity cost. You've chosen this line of work for a particular reason. Why did you decide to go into this work and then stay with it?
Well, it's an interesting market for a whole bunch of different reasons. I took this job straight out of university, so it's my one and only. So it was a decision that was made because it's in the renewable space, so it's environmentally friendly. I met the owner and he was great, so it seemed like a great shop to join. But the evolution of the markets that we've been dealing with over the last 10 years that I've been with the company has been really dramatic. So it's constantly evolving. We're constantly having to adapt. So it's exciting as well as challenging, just to keep at the front edge of sort of the evolutions that are happening in the market and figuring out how to monetize it. At the end of the day, we're taking waste materials and producing value-added products. So it's, often we're finding ourselves at the nexus between the waste industry and power markets, gas markets, commodity markets. But it's broadly sort of this connection between the waste industry and energy, which are not necessarily they don't necessarily fit well together. So there's a lot of opportunity there. There's a lot of uncertainty, and our role is really to help connect the dots in this evolving landscape. So it's can be quite challenging, but also rewarding at the same time.
Now, you mentioned environmental earlier. What about the environmental aspect drew you to it?
Well, so originally when I joined the company, we were doing a lot of woody biomass to power projects, and the carbon accounting there can be distilled quite simply to that a tree over the course of its life will absorb CO2 and release oxygen. It sequesters that carbon, and so when you cut a tree to use it for lumber or pulp and paper, and you burn the residues, you're simply releasing the same carbon that the tree sequestered originally back into the atmosphere. So it's leaving aside that there would be, trucking of the material from the source to the biomass plant, which has some carbon emissions there. It's broadly carbon neutral, and it's baseload power, which for the purposes of a stable grid, there's benefits there. So it's a good source of renewable energy. In addition to that, you're avoiding any methane emissions related to the wood sort of decomposing on its own. So from the start, it always seemed quite intuitive that the better we get at managing these types of resources, the greater cost savings, the greater carbon emission savings, we can provide to society. So, from the start, it was always attractive. And recently we've done quite a bit more work in the food waste space, and the numbers on that side are equally significant. So I just looked at a study the other day where they were looking at food waste and emissions related to food waste in Canada, and I'm looking at a data set right now. So there are roughly 5.5 million tons of food waste in Canada each year. The food waste that goes to a landfill, for every ton that's disposed in a landfill, there's 1.25 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent released, because a lot of that's methane. Methane, of course, has a much higher greenhouse gas effect, sort of global warming effect than carbon dioxide, because it's a bigger molecule. It traps more heat, as opposed to where the projects that we're supporting are generally anaerobic digestion. Food waste going to those markets releases 0.05 tons of CO2 equivalent per ton disposed. So very significant savings. And going back to your original question, these are all compelling from an environmental standpoint, and I think that's one of the things that keeps us coming in and working as hard as we do every day.
So, have you always been environmentally conscious?
I think so. I think as a millennial, and I hate to make a generational sort of broad statement, but I think that we grew up in public school learning about environmental issues. I remember, I can think back to like grade 3 when we started hearing about species extinctions and global warming, and so I think we really grew up with these issues. So yeah, I mean, it's something that these are issues that aren't going away and are really going to define our generation. So yeah, I think it's extremely important to get it right.
So, that's really interesting. I've spoken to many millennials, and I've never heard anyone tell me or explain to me that they were taught about the significance of the environment at such an early age. I'm an immigrant to the country. I've been here, let's just say, just a little over 25 years. So I didn't go to school here, but I've never heard anyone tell me that, which makes so much more sense now, especially with these recent movements that, you've been hearing this for a long time. And so for it to be part of your life is almost natural.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And, there's been news coming out recently that I've been really interested in, that I was reading about yesterday. but I'd heard of before where countries all over the world are using satellites to basically do imaging, infrared imaging of pollution in the world. And it's gotten to a resolution only recently where we can actually look at the emissions from individual sort of point sources. So a landfill, a coal power plant, etc. So, I think it's benefiting society that, in addition to sort of these broader narratives around global warming, that we're reaching a technological point where we can, with more rigor and detail, really get a much better view on what the sources are. It's just adding to the data set, right, that we're all sort of working from, and as a global society trying to develop solutions for. But yeah, I mean, it's I think when we were young, it was that the ice caps are melting and the polar bears are going to lose their habitat, and now the more data that we're acquiring, even fugitive methane emissions from some of the oil and gas storage and drilling sites are shocking even people that have been in the industry for a long time. So it's the more data that we get, the clearer picture we have, and the better the strategies to be able to deal with it.
Absolutely. So you mentioned sources. So I have a couple of questions around sources. One is, from your opinion, if you could wave a magic wand and say, I just can't wait till I don't see this kind of waste anymore, what would that be? And the second is, you mentioned anaerobic digestion, but do you have any quote unquote favorite technologies or technologies on the horizon that you think over the next 10 years you might see a huge increase in?
So, I think the easy answer is all waste would be best avoided. We're in the food waste industry. I think just the statistics on the amount of food waste that we all generate, on a daily or weekly or annual basis, it's pretty staggering. And then thinking about the cost, the costs related to that, the amount of carbon required to come and pick up the food waste and dispose of it. It all requires us, I think, to think about our role in this waste problem. Food waste is certainly a big deal. I think there's been a lot of news recently about plastics in the ocean and the West exporting a lot of plastics to China, who has since curtailed that importation. So now we're left to figure out what we're going to do with millions of tons of plastic. So I think it's all a big problem that we're going to have to deal with and find local and domestic solutions for. The one technology that I'm particularly interested in is sort of getting off of natural gas as a heat source and moving more towards ground or air source heat pumps, or large scale biomass thermal plants. So you see this a lot in Europe where they have central heating. They'll have a centralized plant. They will have pipes that move hot water from the plant to businesses or homes. And to the extent that we can sort of get rid of, a natural gas heating system in every home and move towards, a renewable source of heat, I think that would be hugely impactful.
Now, how close to the residential areas are some of these plants in Europe?
I actually don't know. I mean, I would imagine pretty close because the cost of laying the the hot water pipes is probably going to be a significant cost. But yeah, I think they, they would have particulate control, so eliminating any soot or particulates that the plant would release. Maybe even probably other emissions controls, and they would build big smokestacks to let the gases out high enough that it doesn't bother anyone. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, unfortunately.
And that's why I was asking, because I know there's this NIMBY movement, not in my backyard, and I feel like every once in a while. So I had a conversation about nuclear yesterday with another gentleman here that I work with, and some people think nuclear is a good idea, some people don't. But when it comes down to brass tacks, people would like it, but not in their backyard. And things like, we still have residual memory from things like, let's call it Fukushima, Chernobyl.
Sure.
Still a significant population that remembers the World War II. And so I was just curious, as far as, I know sometimes people like the idea of alternatives, but as long as the alternative is somewhere else and not in their backyards.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. To the extent that we could potentially leverage some of the existing infrastructure and revitalizing maybe some of the old coal power plants in the U.S. and Canada that have been shuttered, refueling it with a domestic fuel source like woody biomass, and providing low cost heat. I think there's definitely an opportunity to do something like that, where the plant's already there. It's sort of a legacy plant, and so it might avoid some of those new build issues.
Absolutely. And since you mentioned food waste, I released an episode this morning with a gentleman named Aidan, who has a technology called Hazel Technologies, and essentially his technology prevents food from aging, so it gives fresh produce a longer shelf life, all the way from grower to the consumer. You might find that interesting.
Yeah, I mean, look, the ultimate carbon abatement strategy is to not waste at all. And I don't know if this is big in the U.S., but here in Canada, where the grocery stores are starting to sell what they call ugly fruits and vegetables. So food items that didn't necessarily pass the eye test. They're now starting to market these foods, which are perfectly fine. They just they may have some type of it doesn't have the perfect shape. So they're selling these foods at a discount rate. I was reading the other day that Canada and some European countries, again, I don't know if this exists in the States, but any food that's donated to a food bank, there is sort of a liability coverage there, so that if it eliminates some of the liability concerns related to donating expired food to people that need it. So, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different strategies to eliminate the actual production of waste food, and if there's a mechanism to keep fruits and vegetables fresh longer, I think that's a tool in the toolbox.
Absolutely. So, Brett, I like to end the show with a question about, if you could share some advice or words of wisdom with the audience, what would it be?
So I've thought a lot about this, and I think that the main words of wisdom would be that all the growth that we've seen in these markets, whether it's anaerobic digestion, biomass power, wood pellets that are being manufactured in the U.S. and shipped to Europe, they're all policy driven markets, these are, whether it's waste bans or carbon reduction, the need for strong policy is clearly there. There are regions where policy is so strong that industry is going to really struggle to develop the infrastructure required to be able to manage the volumes of materials that we're talking about. I'm thinking of, specifically California, which has a waste ban. Ontario, where we are, has a similar waste ban, and there's big concerns around the ability for to construct the infrastructure required to handle this type of waste. But I mean, that's a good problem to have. So broadly, I think, that these are policy-driven markets. It requires the policy, and so it requires politicians and the public to really get behind these courses of action. So ultimately, it's a political issue, and to the extent that we can all sort of mobilize and ensure that these policies, continue to be written and advanced, and not eliminated. It has a massive potential to reduce greenhouse gases and create the circular economy that I think we're all hoping will happen in our lifetime. So I guess my advice is, let's be political, and Raj, you're doing your part. You've created a podcast that shares information, and people are, able to access information that propels the political drive. So thank you for what you're doing and for having me. But that's my advice.
Thank you, Brett. And if I were to tease out what you said, I would say get involved, and people can make a difference. So I really appreciate your time today, Brett, too. And I look forward to catching up with you again in the future.